The only thing that it shares in common, the Plasmodia protists, with your dog and your cat is that it's a eukaryote. Everything else about it is different. And you would expect that. If you go back and you look at the characteristics of protists, they're very different than animals. So that's why you wouldn't expect to see this classification as being similar. All right, so why all of this naming? So sorting, if you think about this like sorting mail, the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species is very much like how mail gets to your house. You start with a broad zip code. You may look at the state and the city, and then you're going to go to the street and then the house number, and then there's somebody in your house that kind of gets down to the species level that would receive the mail. So again, mailing things is a lot like classification because it allows us to communicate in a way worldwide that allows us to send a piece of mail to someone in a different country, or it allows us to talk about a specific organism with somebody who's in a different country. All right, these groups should look pretty familiar to you, as do many of the things that are on these slides. So what you may want to think about doing is going back to your cards instead of rewriting everything on these next sets of slides. I would go back to what we did in the Who's Who activity and just make sure that these are the bullet points that you wrote down. Remember, if I gave you this, I would expect you to be able to tell me that it's in the bacteria kingdom based on the characteristics that you see. So make sure that the things that you wrote down for each of the kingdoms is complete in regards to the things I'm going to go over. So to start with, all bacteria are single cell or unicellular. They're prokaryotic, which means they have no nucleus. You've heard this a ton of times. These are usually classified into smaller groups, and that's done by shapes. Most bacteria are rod shaped, they're sphere shaped, or they kind of look like spirals. So once we have that bigger kingdom, we can divide these up into 3 smaller groups based on the shape that they have. These guys are enclosed by a cell wall that you see that I'm kind of highlighting a little bit at the end of the pointer, right? And that is something that they have in common with plants. So kind of keep that in mind. They also have a cell membrane too. So again, something that they have in common with plants. Plants have cell walls and cell membranes, and so do bacteria. Some bacteria cause diseases. On the other hand, some are super beneficial, like I mentioned earlier. Some bacteria are used to make cheese and yogurt, for example. One other structure that I want to point out is that bacteria, and only in bacteria where you see all these little hairs that are labeled, those are called flagella because they're a single long strand of hair that many bacteria have. When we look at other groups, flagella will have a little bit of a different meaning, so kind of keep that in mind. Protists are unicellular and multicellular. So again, this means many. Multi means many. However, the majority of protists are probably going to fall on the unicellular side of things. These guys are eukaryotic. So it means they have a nucleus. So this is one way that they're different from bacteria, one way you would be able to tell them apart. The other thing, when we look at protists, these guys typically are classified by how they move. They can move by cilia, which if there were little hairs, little tiny hairs everywhere all over this, guy, those would be called cilia. If there's one big long whip, then this would be called a flagella. So flagella are typically one, maybe two longer structures, whereas cilia are shorter hairs that would surround the whole outer covering. The other way that protists can move are something called pseudopods. And so let's take a second and talk about that. Pseudo stands for false, and pod means foot. Okay, so when we look at this, and this is an amoeba, and he does a great job of showing us some pseudopods. So this is a pseudopod. That's a pseudopod. All right, there's some smaller ones here. And basically, they're considered to be a small foot because they look like they're stretching out and moving. And they kind of move the amoeba forward just a little bit as he goes. They can also encompass food. So if this guy would come around here and close like this and there were food inside of this, he would be able to pull that food through his cell membrane to his inner part, where he then would send it to the food vacuole where it would be digested. Okay, I already talked about amoebas as an example. Parameciums are another example of protists that we will look at throughout the course of the semester as well. Our next group are plants. Plants can be unicellular or multicellular. Majority of them are going to be multicellular. There's that word eukaryotic again. Plants, unlike animals, are going to be non-modal. All right. And non-modal means not moving. So I know that you're thinking, well, wait a minute, I see trees blow in the wind all the time. Right. But plants cannot get up and physically walk from one location to the next. That's what I mean by non-modal. They use photosynthesis to get their food. So when we talk about organisms that can make their own food, often they're called autotrophs. All right, so autotroph, auto means self and troph means feeder. So these guys can feed themselves. We also will hear them referred to as producers because they produce their own food. These guys, if you look just at this picture of the plant cell, you can tell that it has a lot of specialized parts. These specialized parts are called organelles. And these organelles all do specific jobs within the plant cell. Again, coming back to these, this has a cell wall and a cell membrane. That cell membrane's inside the cell wall, just like bacteria do. So kind of keep that in mind as you think about how to keep these apart or how to be able to tell these different cells apart. Animal cells are all multicellular. They're eukaryotic. Just like plant cells, they have specialized organelles. The difference between animals and plants is that, one big difference, I should say, is that these guys obtain nutrition from some other source. So when we talk about these guys, these are heterotrophs, or another word that you may have referred to them as is consumers. Right. And last but not least, fungi can be both unicellular and multicellular. They're all eukaryotic. Characteristic they have in common with both bacteria and plants is that they have cell walls. The big difference with these guys is that they obtain nutrients by breaking down their food outside of the body, and then they will transport those broken down parts by absorbing it through the cell wall and the cell membrane. If you've ever, or you like mushrooms on your pizza or in your omelet, you've eaten a fungus. If you eat bread, whether that's a bagel or a slice of bread, whatever it may be, again, you have eaten the remnants of a fungi because yeast is used to help bread rise. So both of those products, bagels and bread, use that to help break down their food. All right, so let's talk for a second about viruses. All right, so last but not least, in talking a little bit about viruses, the picture that you see on the screen is a virus. And no, there's not even though this looks like there's a little hidden Mickey in here, he's definitely a hidden Mickey that you do not want to come across. Because this particular virus is the Ebola virus. And of the strains of Ebola, most of them are extremely dangerous to humans. If you were to contract Ebola, it usually kills somewhere between 85 to 95% of humans that it comes in contact with. So, in thinking a little bit about viruses, these guys are not made up of cells, right? So they can't reproduce on their own. They require a host. So if we're thinking about the characteristics of a living thing, we're not checking very many boxes on this list so far. They do have genetic material, and that genetic material could be DNA or RNA. So it could be either one for these guys. But that DNA is not in a nucleus. It's encapsulated in a protein coat. So if you look at the picture up here, you can see the DNA, and then you can see kind of like the structure around it. You can also see that over on this picture. You see the RNA inside of the protein coat that exists. Viruses come in a variety of shapes. So if you look at a virus, you're not going to necessarily be able to identify it by its shape because there are so many. At the present time, scientists do not classify viruses as being alive because they don't meet enough of the criteria that we've talked about in regards to the characteristics of life. But you never know, that might change. I mean, look at poor Pluto. Pluto's been a planet, not been a planet, been a planet, not been a planet. So this very well could change in the future.